On a rain-slicked night in August 1793, the Sans-Culottes docked quietly in Philadelphia. The ship had arrived from the Caribbean, smelling of bilge water and rotting fruit, its ropes creaking against the humidity. The United States of America was only 17 years old, a fragile idea held together by debt and optimism. Its capital, Philadelphia, was the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan city in North America, the brain of the government and the heart of its financial system. In this city, everything was tallied. Every barrel of sugar, every bond issued, and every hour of labor was recorded in heavy, leather-bound accounting books. The city existed in a delicate balance of credit and trust, but as the sailors of the Sans-Culottes slept on the deck, a microscopic stowaway, the Aedes aegypti mosquito, landed on an exposed forearm. Its bite went unnoticed, yet it signaled the beginning of a new kind of accounting. By September, the orderly rows of the merchant's ledger would be replaced by the chaotic scribbles of the death register. Before the year was out, 5,000 people, 10% of the city's population, would die. This was the first great stress test of the American experiment, proving that when health collapses, credit dies first, and when credit dies, the government is not far behind. To understand the catastrophe, one must understand the prize. In 1793, Philadelphia was the center of the American universe. It was New York, Washington, D.C., and Silicon Valley rolled into one, the home of the president, the Congress, and the banks. It was an incredibly dense walking city where 50,000 people lived crammed between the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers. The streets were crowded with people of all nations and languages, and the noise of carriages was incessant. George Washington lived in a mansion on High Street, while Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton walked the pavements daily. The engravings of the time depict a city of order and majesty, but just beneath the surface, the young republic was terrified of failure. The lifeblood of Philadelphia was not politics, but commerce, driven by an engine of credit. Before 1793, America had been an economic basket case, awash in worthless paper currency. But a financial miracle had occurred in the early 1790s, creating a modern banking system almost overnight. Suddenly, merchants could borrow against future shipments, and mechanics could buy tools on credit. The whole city ran on promises to pay later. This web of credit was powerful, fueling unprecedented growth, but it was also deeply vulnerable. It required constant movement and confidence. If one thread snapped, the whole web threatened to unravel. The architect of this system, Alexander Hamilton, had tied the fate of the federal government directly to the financial health of Philadelphia's merchant class. He realized that a strong nation needed strong credit, so he federalized state debts and created the Bank of the United States, headquartered in the city. He turned debt into capital. But this success meant the U.S. Treasury was frighteningly dependent on the customs duties collected at the Philadelphia port. 90% of the federal government's revenue came from taxes on imports arriving by sea. If the Port of Philadelphia closed, the United States government would effectively go bankrupt. The wealth on display in Philadelphia's parlors could not be separated from the brutal reality of the Atlantic trade. The ships arriving at the docks carried sugar and coffee harvested by enslaved Africans in places like Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. Philadelphia traded with the engines of death in the West Indies to finance its own liberty. But in the summer of 1793, that connection brought something else. Saint-Domingue was in the throes of a violent slave revolution, and thousands of white French refugees were fleeing the island, cramming onto ships bound for Philadelphia. They brought stories of terror and, unbeknownst to anyone, inside the wooden water casks on their ships, they brought the larval seeds of a biological disaster. The summer of 1793 was one of the hottest and wettest in living memory. The city steamed in the heat, and stagnant pools of water collected in alleys and cellar holes. Residents complained that the air seemed thick and unbreathable, and the mosquitoes were a torment, more numerous and ferocious than ever before. While the citizens swatted at the bugs, they feared the air itself. The prevailing medical theory of miasma held that disease was spread by foul odors and rotting matter. Despite the oppressive heat, there was an incredible sense of hubris in the capital. They had just built a magnificent new government, the economy was booming, and the ledger books were full. The warehouses were bursting, and the newspapers were filled with advertisements for imported goods. The city felt invincible, completely unprepared for the microscopic auditor that had just arrived on Water Street. The invasion did not begin with a cannon blast, but with a series of quiet, agonizing deaths in the cramped boarding houses along the waterfront. In early August, strange reports began to filter up from Water Street. At Denny's lodging house, a popular stop for sailors, residents were falling ill with a ferocity that baffled local apothecaries. The symptoms were terrifyingly consistent: a sudden onset of chills, a throbbing pain behind the eyes, and a fever that seemed to boil the blood. Within days, the skin would turn the color of old parchment, and the patient would vomit a black, tarry substance, coagulated blood from internal hemorrhaging. On August 19th, Dr. Benjamin Rush, the city's most celebrated physician and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was summoned to the bedside of Peter Lemaigre on Water Street. Rush was a man of the Enlightenment, a believer in logic and science. But what he saw in that room shook him. The smell of the room was distinct, a metallic, putrid odor that Rush recognized from his youth. He stepped out onto the humid street and made a proclamation that would freeze the blood of every citizen. This was not a summer flu. It was the bilious, remitting yellow fever, a plague that had not been seen in Philadelphia for 30 years. Panic is often faster than contagion. Rush immediately sought a cause, desperate to explain the sudden eruption of death. His eyes fell upon a shipment of coffee that had been dumped on a wharf near Arch Street. The coffee had rotted in the heat, emitting a foul stench. In accordance with the medical dogma of the time, Rush and the city's doctors became convinced that this miasma, the bad air rising from the decaying vegetable matter, was the source of the sickness. They ordered the streets cleaned and bonfires lit to purify the air, unknowingly creating more smoke and heat in an already stifling city. While the doctors waged war on bad smells, the true enemy was breeding unnoticed in the rain barrels and cisterns of every backyard. The Aedes aegypti mosquito is a relentless urban predator. Unlike other mosquitoes that breed in swamps, this species prefers the clean, still water found in man-made containers. It does not travel far, usually no more than a few hundred yards from where it is born. This biology dictated the geography of the terror. The disease moved house by house, block by block, tracing the social network of the city. It was an intimate killer, visiting neighbors who stopped to chat and families sharing water pumps. By the end of August, the pretense of normalcy collapsed. The death toll rose from single digits to dozens a day. The unique horror of yellow fever was its speed. A man could be conducting business on the exchange in the morning and be dead by sunset. Fear turned the bustling port into a ghost town. The sound of heavy wagons on cobblestones, usually the music of commerce, became the sound of dread. It meant the dead carts were coming to collect bodies that families were too terrified to touch. The French refugees, already traumatized by the revolution in Saint-Domingue, found themselves scapegoated. Because the disease had originated in the Caribbean, xenophobia flared. Yet, ironically, the refugees died in lower numbers than the locals. Many had survived childhood bouts of the fever in the tropics and possessed acquired immunity. The American population had no such protection. The fever burned through the Irish laborers, the German bakers, and the wealthy Quaker merchants with equal ruthlessness. As the fever spiked, the financial heart of the new republic stopped beating. Philadelphia ran on a system of commercial paper, IOUs and promissory notes exchanged between merchants. A merchant would buy goods on credit, promising to pay in 30, 60, or 90 days. This system relied entirely on presence. You had to be there to pay your debts. But as the death toll mounted, the mercantile class did the only thing that could save their lives. They fled. Within weeks, 20,000 people, nearly half the city's population, evacuated. This exodus triggered an immediate liquidity crisis. When notes came due, the debtors were gone. The banks, sensing catastrophe, stopped discounting paper. They refused to lend new money. The web of credit that Hamilton had so carefully spun snapped overnight. The First Bank of the United States, the marble temple of American finance, effectively shut its doors to borrowers. With the banks frozen and the wealthy gone, the flow of cash into the city ceased. For the working poor who remained, the stevedores, washerwomen, and free black community, the economy didn't just recede, it vanished. Prices for basic survival goods skyrocketed. A cord of wood for fires, usually affordable, became a luxury item. But the most inflated commodity was care. The price of a nurse or a gravedigger rose by 500%. The poor found themselves trapped in a deadly pincer. They had lost their wages because the businesses were closed, yet the cost of staying alive had tripled. The evacuation of the wealthy revealed the brutal class lines of the young republic. Those with country estates or relatives inland packed their carriages and left. The roads leading out of Philadelphia were clogged with the possessions of the fleeing elite. Behind them, they left a city of labor ghosts, unemployed workers wandering streets that smelled of vinegar, used unsuccessfully to ward off infection, and death. Without masters to pay them or markets to feed them, the poor began to starve. The sickness ledger was no longer just counting the infected, it was counting the destitute. As September arrived, the fear that had emptied the markets finally breached the halls of power. The federal government, the very symbol of the nation's permanence, began to dissolve. Congressmen, who had spent the spring debating the minutiae of tariffs and treaties, now had only one agenda item: survival. They did not vote to adjourn. They simply vanished. The grand debates of the State House were replaced by the hurried packing of trunks. The departure was not orderly. It was a rout. Essential government functions were abandoned midstream. Documents of state were locked in desks or hastily crated up. The government of the United States
less than a decade under the Constitution, was effectively decapitated. On September 10th, the president himself surrendered the city. George Washington, the stoic general who had held the line at Valley Forge, could not hold the line against the fever. He departed for Mount Vernon, leaving behind a power vacuum that was palpable. His departure signaled to the remaining citizens that hope was gone. If the father of the country could not stay, who could? Washington left with a heavy heart, but his flight created a constitutional crisis. He was the head of the executive branch, but he was now hundreds of miles from his cabinet, most of
whom were scattered across the countryside. The mechanisms of the federal government ground to a halt. For 6 weeks, the United States of America existed in name only. The crisis became personal for the administration when the fever came for its most vital architect. Alexander Hamilton, who had been frantically trying to manage the Treasury from his home just outside the city limits, collapsed. He and his wife Betsy both contracted the disease. News of Hamilton's illness sent shockwaves through the financial markets that were already teetering. The man who held the nation's credit in his head was delirious with fever. But Hamilton, ever the contrarian, refused Dr. Rush's heroic cure of massive bloodletting. Instead, he turned to his childhood friend, Dr. Edward Stevens, who had treated yellow fever in the West Indies. Stevens used a gentler method: cold baths, Madeira wine, and Peruvian bark, quinine. Hamilton survived. While Hamilton recovered, his department collapsed. The Treasury clerks, the men who actually processed the customs duties and paid the government's bills, joined the exodus. The doors of the Treasury building were locked. The ships were stopped at the river. The customs collectors were dying or fleeing, and the revenue stream that paid the interest on the national debt was severed. The United States was perilously close to defaulting on its loans to Europe. Just outside the city limits stood Bush Hill, a commandeered mansion that had been turned into a lazaretto, a quarantine hospital. In early September, Bush Hill was not a hospital. It was a warehouse for the dying. Patients were dumped there by terrifying relatives or city constables. There were no nurses, no order, and almost no food. The sick lay on the floor in their own filth, crying out for water that no one brought. It was a place of such horror that neighbors reported the smell of the mansion drifting across the fields. To be sent to Bush Hill was considered a death sentence. Into this hell walked the unlikeliest of saviors. Stephen Girard was a French-born merchant, arguably the wealthiest man in Philadelphia. He was known as cold, calculating, and solitary, a man who loved ledgers more than people. But as the city's elite fled, Girard did something that defied all logic. He stayed. On September 16th, Girard volunteered to take charge of Bush Hill. He didn't just fund it, he managed it. The richest merchant in America rolled up his sleeves and walked into the wards, reorganizing the hospital with the efficiency of a shipping magnate. He cleaned bedpans, washed patients, and held the hands of the dying. Alongside him was Peter Helm, a German cooper who managed the external logistics. Together, the merchant and the mechanic transformed the slaughterhouse into a sanctuary. Girard and Helm could not do it alone. The backbone of the relief effort came from Philadelphia's Black community. Dr. Benjamin Rush, operating under the tragic misconception that Black people were immune to the fever, had written to Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, leaders of the Free African Society. He begged them to supply nurses and gravediggers. The immunity theory was false. Black Philadelphians died at the same rate as whites. Yet, even as they realized the danger, they did not retreat. The Free African Society mobilized the entire Black community. They went into the houses of the white wealthy who had fled, caring for the abandoned sick. They drove the dead carts when no one else would. They dug the graves. They saved the city that had marginalized them, performing the most dangerous labor for little to no praise. In the aftermath, they would be slandered by accusations of price gouging, forcing Allen and Jones to publish a powerful rebuttal, the first copyrighted pamphlet by African Americans, detailing their sacrifice and the true ledger of their service. By October, the city was unrecognizable. The streets were silent except for the creaking of the wheels. The dead house at the Potter's Field was overflowing. The sheer volume of corpses overwhelmed the city's capacity to bury them. Coffins were stacked like cordwood. The economy of the city had mutated into a macabre shadow of itself. The only boom industry was death. Carpenters stopped building houses and started building pine boxes. The price of camphor and vinegar spiked. The city was populated by labor ghosts, widows and orphans of the working class who roamed the streets, stunned and starving. The social contract had completely ruptured. There was no law, no trade, only the waiting. Salvation did not come from medicine. It came from the sky. In late October, the temperature dropped. A frost settled over the roofs of Philadelphia. The citizens didn't know why, but as the water in the rain barrels froze, the plague broke. The frost killed the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. The buzzing stopped. The new cases plummeted from hundreds a day to zero. The miasma had not cleared, but the vector was dead. As November brought colder winds, the refugees began to return. They found a city traumatized and hollowed out. Shops reopened, but many owners were missing. Families were reunited, only to learn of the holes in their ranks. The final accounting began. The ledger was tallied. 5,000 dead. In a city of 50,000, everyone knew a victim. The federal government drifted back in, sheepish and shaken. Washington returned to his desk. Hamilton returned to his Treasury. The gears of finance began to turn again. The ships were unloaded. The credit flowed. But the city was different. It had stared into the abyss of total collapse. It had learned that the ledger of a nation includes more than just dollars and cents. It includes the biological fragility of its people. The frost killed the mosquitoes, but it could not kill the recriminations. As the city thawed in the spring of 1794, the relief turned into rage. The blame wars began, tearing the fragile political fabric of the capital apart. The medical debate immediately morphed into a political one. Dr. Benjamin Rush, an ardent Republican, insisted the fever was domestic, born of the city's own filth and corruption. His opponents, the Federalists, insisted the disease was foreign, imported by the French refugees. To admit the sickness was domestic was to admit that the American capital was rotten at its core. To blame it on foreigners was politically convenient. The press became the new battlefield, culminating in a landmark libel trial between Rush and the writer William Cobbett. The unity of the City of Brotherly Love had evaporated, replaced by the partisan trench warfare that would define American politics for centuries. Yet, from this wreckage came progress. The sheer terror of 1793 forced the government to act. Philadelphia created the nation's first permanent board of health and built the Lazaretto quarantine station. The city also realized it could not survive on dirty water, leading to the construction of the Fairmount Water Works, an engineering marvel that pumped clean water from the Schuylkill River. The yellow fever epidemic of 1793 directly birthed the modern American concept of public infrastructure. The ledger of death had forced an investment in life. The financial landscape also shifted. Stephen Girard, the coal merchant who had nursed the dying at Bush Hill, emerged as a hero. His bravery bought him immense social capital, and he would go on to become the wealthiest man in America, eventually personally financing the U.S. government during the War of 1812. The man who managed the ledger of death became the banker who saved the nation. The Mosquito remains. Aedes aegypti is still with us, following the warming climate. The ledger of 1793 is a dusty artifact now, locked in the archives of the American Philosophical Society. But its lesson is timeless. A society is only as strong as its health. An economy built on denial will eventually face a reckoning. And when the fever breaks, the bills must be paid. When the federal government evaporated in September, a vacuum of power threatened to destroy what the fever had not yet touched. Into this void stepped a new, unauthorized authority, the Committee of Citizens. This was not a government elected by ballot, but one forged by imminent death. On September 12th, in the shadowy, vinegar-soaked chamber of City Hall, a group of 24 men gathered. They were not the famous founding fathers. Jefferson and Hamilton were gone, but the middle-class merchants, tradesmen, and minor officials who had nowhere else to run. They looked at the city's empty coffers and made a decision that defied the Constitution. They would seize control of the public purse. The committee operated outside the law to save the law. With the banks paralyzed and tax collection suspended, they acted as a rogue treasury. They seized the estate of the deceased overseers of the poor, commandeered supplies from abandoned warehouses, and took out personal loans against their own credit to fund the city's survival. This was the ultimate financial gamble. If they died, their families would be ruined, and the debts would go unpaid. They appointed a committee of accounts to track every shilling spent on coffins, cartage, and bread. In the midst of anarchy, they maintained a meticulous ledger of the apocalypse, recording the price of survival down to the penny. They ruled Philadelphia for 60 days, a shadow government that proved a city could function without a president, but not without a bookkeeper. As the frost settled and the city began to breathe again, a second battle erupted, not over bodies, but over truth. The publisher Matthew Carey released a popular account of the epidemic that praised the white volunteers, but slandered the free black community, accusing them of plundering the sick and overcharging for burials. This accusation struck at the heart of the Free African Society, whose members had walked into death traps when white families had fled. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, the leaders of the black community, realized that history was being written by the deserters, not the saviors. They understood that their reputation was a form of currency, and it was being devalued. In response, they did something revolutionary. They audited the white population. In 1794, they published a narrative of the proceedings of the black people, a pamphlet that served as a counterledger to Carey's lies. With forensic precision, they listed the names of the black nurses who had died, the specific dates of their service, and the financial accounts of the burials. They contrasted their own behavior with that of the white citizens who had abandoned their own children and spouses. They recounted stories of black nurses finding bags of gold in the homes of the dead and returning them untouched to the orphans. This document was more than a defense. It was a bill of moral credit presented to a bankrupt society. It asserted that while the white establishment controlled the banks, the black community held the moral capital of the city. The terror of 1793 left a permanent scar on the municipal psyche, birthing a new political philosophy that health was a purchasable commodity. The miasma theory, though medically incorrect, led to the correct conclusion that a filthy city was a deadly one. The city fathers looked at the stagnant, green scum of the local wells and realized the cost of cheap water was too high.
They authorized a financial undertaking of unprecedented scale, the construction of the Fairmount Waterworks. Benjamin Latrobe, the architect of the Capitol, was hired to design a system that would use steam engines to pump the Schuylkill River into the homes of Philadelphia. It was a massive capital expense, funded by bonds and taxes that would have been unthinkable before the fever. The waterworks was a cathedral to public health, a marble temple housing roaring engines that pushed clean water through miles of wooden pipes. It was the first time an American city spent its wealth to immunize its population through engineering. The ledger of 1793 had closed with a deficit of 5,000 lives. But the new ledger opened with an investment in the idea that the government's primary duty was to keep its taxpayers alive. The water flowed, the fever retreated, and Philadelphia became the model for the modern sanitary city, a metropolis built on the graves of the uncounted. The physical ledgers of 1793 reside today in the hushed, climate-controlled archives of Philadelphia, their pages brittle and brown with the oxidation of iron gall ink. They are no longer active accounts, but they remain the founding documents of American crisis management. The yellow fever of 1793 did not merely kill 5,000 people. It killed the innocence of the American experiment. It shattered the illusion that a democratic republic was immune to the chaotic forces of nature that plagued the monarchies of Europe. It forced the realization that the pursuit of happiness was impossible without the guarantee of health, and that the wealth of nations was inextricably bound to the biology of its citizens. Before 1793, the American government was an abstract concept, a collection of papers and ideals. After 1793, it was a physical necessity, a machine required to clean streets, purify water, and manage the border between safety and pestilence. The epidemic transformed the city from a passive collection of merchants into an active body politic. The ghost of the fever walks the modern streets of Philadelphia, not in the form of specters, but in the infrastructure itself, in the clean water running through the pipes, in the hospitals that line the avenues, and in the very existence of public health departments across the nation. Yet, the sickness ledger is never truly closed. The Aedes aegypti mosquito, once banished by the frost, waits in the warming margins of a changing climate, a persistent auditor of human complacency. The lesson of that sweltering summer remains as sharp as a lancet. The economy is a fragile construct, a shared hallucination of value that vanishes the moment the fever spikes. In the end, the ledger proved that while gold can be counted and debts can be structured, the only currency that truly matters is the breath in one's lungs. The city survived, the republic endured, but the price of that survival is eternal vigilance, a debt that can never be fully paid, only serviced, generation after generation.